They thought he was just another nobody in a hoodie, a man they could ignore, disrespect, and poison. But when the silver dome lifted, the secret on the napkin didn't just save his life, it started a war. Because today, the billionaire isn't just eating, he's hunting. Today, they spit in your food. Those 5 words, scribbled in frantic, jagged lines across a folded linen napkin, hit harder than any corporate hostile takeover or stock market crash ever could. They didn't just deliver a warning. They delivered a shockwave that stopped Billionaire CEO Elias Thorne mid-bite, freezing his silver fork just inches from his lips. For a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of Wall Street, survived brutal boardroom betrayals, and built an empire from nothing, this was different. This wasn't a business maneuver. This wasn't a play for power. This was a visceral, personal violation that was about to explode into a dark saga, one that would tear the polished veneer off an entire industry. Elias Thorne didn't come to the Gilded Hearth, a high-end establishment he quietly owned through a web of holdings, for the dry-aged Wagyu or the prestige. He came as a ghost. Dressed in a plain, faded navy hoodie and beat-up sneakers, he walked through the heavy oak doors as a man invisible to the high society eyes that usually catered to him. He was there to investigate whispers that had reached his office in New York, anonymous letters detailing a culture of racially biased service and stomach-churning kitchen practices in his flagship Charleston location. He wanted to see the truth with his own eyes, alone. No security detail, no PR team, no special treatment. But from the moment he stepped onto the antique hardwood floors, the reality was worse than the rumors. He was scanned by a hostess whose smile was as cold as marble, dismissed because of his clothes, and led past the vibrant tables of the elite to a cramped spot by the restroom and the swinging kitchen doors. He sat there for 10 full minutes, ignored, as waiters skipped his table entirely to serve those wearing Rolexes and country club memberships. Then there was Maya Vance. She was a waitress with eyes that held a lifetime of quiet fear and shoes worn down to the bone from double shifts. She didn't ask him for help. She didn't beg for a hero. She simply slid a note under his coffee cup, a silent act of defiance that risked everything she had left. Maya wasn't just a server. She was a witness to a polished, poisonous system. This isn't just a story about food. It's a story about the raw courage of a woman who stood in the shadows and decided that tonight, the silence would end. It's about the hidden layers of prejudice that haunt the halls of privilege and how one woman's bravery forced a reckoning that could not be ignored. If you've ever wondered how justice truly begins, not in a courtroom, but in the dark corners where no one is looking, this is it. Elias Thorne was a man who had mastered the art of turning silence into strategy. At 46, he had become one of the most respected Black CEOs in America, a tech prodigy who turned investor and built a billion-dollar empire through sheer, calculated precision. Every word he spoke was measured. Every deal he closed was the result of discipline and dignity. But all the data in the world couldn't have prepared him for the jagged truth Maya Vance had left under his cup. Long before the penthouse overlooking the city and the Tesla Model S, Elias knew what it felt like to be underestimated. Raised by his grandmother in a small town, he watched his mother scrub the floors of people who wouldn't even look her in the eye, also her son could have a clean shirt for school. His first computer came from a church donation bin. He had built his first company in a garage, but success doesn't erase the memory of the struggle. It just buries it deeper. Behind the corporate boards and the luxury hospitality interests, Elias was still that kid who had to learn how to tie a tie from a video before his first investor pitch. He didn't wear gold watches or designer shoes because he understood a fundamental, ugly truth. The world often judges a Black man by what he wears long before they listen to what he has to say. So when the reports of mistreatment at the Gilded Hearth hit his desk, he didn't send a lawyer. He bought a bus ticket, threw on a hoodie, and walked into the fire himself. No one recognized the titan of industry that night, and that was exactly the point. Sometimes, to see the rot in a system, you have to disappear inside it. He wasn't just a guest, he was a mirror. He wanted the system to see itself, raw, unfiltered, and up close. Because real leadership isn't about being seen. It's about seeing what everyone else is too afraid to look at. The restaurant was a historic mansion, oozing Southern charm and curated exclusivity. Velvet drapes and gold-rimmed glassware created an atmosphere where diners came to be seen, while the walls featured portraits of the past, conveniently unlabeled to soften the harsh edges of history. To the world, it was the cradle of elegance. To Elias, as he sat by the kitchen doors where the smell of bleach drifted in, it felt like the cradle of control. The manager, a man named Julian Vance, moved through the room like a politician, laughing with the wealthy while his eyes skipped over Elias like he was invisible. The restaurant wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as it was designed to, as a performance where appearances outweighed humanity. But Maya Vance was watching. She had once dreamed of being a civil rights lawyer, studying at Howard until her mother's illness forced her to trade her law books for a waitress's apron. She was the only black waitress on staff, enduring double shifts and the subtle, sharp stings of a management that viewed her as barely worth their time. She wore her smile like armor, clearing plates and swallowing her pride daily, but that armor was wearing thin. Tonight, the man in the hoodie at table 14 didn't fit the mold. He was silent, observant, and oddly calm. When she greeted him, he looked her in the eye, really looked at her, and something shook loose inside her. She was done being a silent witness to the whispered slurs and the rules that changed depending on the color of a guest's skin. She was going to act, even if it cost her everything. Before he owned the skyline, he owned the struggle. They saw a man in a hoodie, but they were looking at a ghost from their own darkest shadows. Elias Thorne didn't forget where he came from, and tonight, he's bringing the old neighborhood to the boardroom. Elias Thorne was a man who had mastered the art of turning silence into a lethal strategy. At 46, he had risen to become one of the most respected and formidable black CEOs in America. He was a tech prodigy turned visionary investor, having built a billion-dollar empire not through luck, but through cold, hard precision. In his world, every word was a calculated move, and every deal was a masterpiece of discipline and dignity. But as he sat in the dim light of the gilded hearth, even his decades of data-driven intuition couldn't have prepared him for the raw, jagged truth Maya Vance had just slipped beneath his coffee cup. To the managers of this restaurant, he was just a questionable customer in a hoodie, but to the ghosts of his past, he was a testament to survival. Long before he was the founder of Thorne Capital Holdings, with interests spanning clean energy, fintech, and luxury hospitality, Elias knew the heavy cost of being underestimated. He was a product of a small Alabama town, raised by a grandmother who taught him that integrity was the only thing the world couldn't take from you. He had watched his mother scrub floors until her back bowed. Also, her son could walk into a classroom wearing a shirt without holes. His first window into the world of technology wasn't a sleek tablet. It was a bulky computer salvaged from a church donation bin. By 24, he had already turned a garage startup into a major IPO, using his first big win to build a scholarship fund for kids who looked just like him. But wealth is a strange thing. It can change your zip code, but it doesn't erase your memory. It only buries those memories deeper, where they sit like live coals, waiting for a reason to burn. On paper, Elias lived the American dream. He drove a black Tesla Model S, sat on the boards of 5 major corporations, and spent his nights in a penthouse overlooking the sprawling green of Central Park. Yet, behind those mahogany doors, he was still the same young man who had once stood in a cramped bathroom, watching a YouTube video to learn how to tie a double Windsor knot before his first major investor pitch. He intentionally avoided the trappings of typical billionaire life. No gold watches, no designer labels that screamed for attention. He understood with surgical clarity how quickly the world judges a black man by his exterior before they ever bother to listen to his mind. This was exactly why, when the anonymous letter landed on his desk 2 weeks prior, he didn't call his public relations team or a fleet of high-priced lawyers. The letter alleged that one of his most prestigious properties, this very restaurant, was mistreating its black employees and creating an environment of systemic bias. Elias didn't want a sanitized report from a consultant. He wanted the truth. He bought a bus ticket, threw on his oldest hoodie, and walked into the fire as a stranger. He knew that to see the truth, you have to disappear inside it. He wasn't there as a CEO that night. He was acting as a mirror. He wanted the system he built to see itself in its rawest, most unfiltered form. Because to Elias, real leadership wasn't about the view from the top. It was about having the courage to look at the things no one else wanted to acknowledge. As he sat by the service doors, the weight of the room pressed in on him. The gilded hearth was designed to make people lower their voices in reverence. It oozed and manufactured Southern charm, where the candlelight made every diner feel 10% more important than they actually were. People didn't come here to eat, they came to be seen. But Elias noticed the details that the wealthy patrons ignored. He saw the portraits of the past, strategically placed to evoke a sense of tradition, while ignoring the pain that tradition was built upon. To the website, it was the cradle of elegance, but to Elias, it felt like a cradle of exclusion and control. The hostess had already set the tone, scanning his plain zip-up hoodie and off-brand sneakers like they were a threat to the establishment's sanctity. Her annoyance was a practiced performance, a gatekeeping tactic designed to make those who didn't belong feel the weight of their intrusion. She had offered him a seat at the bar or near the kitchen entrance, assuming a man like him would just be grateful to be inside. Elias had simply nodded, following her through the grand dining room where he saw not a single black face among the diners, only among the staff. Now, sitting near the swinging doors where the smell of bleach hung heavy in the air, he watched the staff. He saw the servers smile brighter for the tables with the Rolexes and the country club memberships. He watched Julian, the manager, glide across the floor like a politician at a fundraiser, laughing with the regulars while his eyes slid right over Elias as if he were part of the furniture. The restaurant wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as it was designed to. It was a place where appearances were the only currency that mattered. But Maya Vance was the variable they hadn't accounted for. She moved with a quiet grace, the kind earned by someone who had seen more than her fair share of hard days. Maya had once had a different path. She was halfway through a law degree at Howard when her mother's cancer diagnosis shattered her world. She had packed her life into a single suitcase and returned to Charleston, taking the first job that would pay the bills. At the Gilded Hearth, Maya was the only black waitress on staff. She felt the invisible rules every day, the way she was scheduled for double shifts, the way she was given the difficult tables, and the way she was blamed for every minor kitchen hiccup. She wore her smile like armor, but tonight, seeing Elias, a man who looked her in the eye and really saw her, that armor began to crack. Maya wasn't just a server anymore. She was a witness to every whispered slur and every injustice that happened behind the velvet curtains. And tonight, she was done watching. She was going to act, even if it meant losing the only thing keeping her family afloat. They thought his hoodie meant his pockets were empty, but his order just set a trap they couldn't escape. When a $700 steak meets a kitchen full of hate, a single napkin becomes the only thing standing between a billionaire and a biological war. Watch closely, because the elite are about to get a taste of their own medicine. The executive prime was not merely a meal. It was a curated spectacle designed for the ultra-wealthy. It was 48 ounces of bone-in Wagyu beef, dry-aged for 90 days to a concentrated richness that few palates ever truly experience. When served, it arrived under a rosemary-smoked glass dome, lifted tableside by a gloved server to release a cloud of aromatic fog that signaled status to the entire room. Accompanied by a foie gras butter and a black truffle potato tower, it carried a staggering price tag of $700. It was a dish built for show, not for the soul. When Elias Thorne looked up from his cramped table near the kitchen door and placed the order, Maya Vance felt the air in her lungs tighten. "You'd like the executive prime," she repeated, her voice steady but her heart beginning to drum a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Elias nodded, his expression as calm and unreadable as a deep lake. "Medium rare, and a bottle of the 2005 Staglin Cabernet." That was another $200 added to the tab with a single breath. Maya had taken orders for this pairing a dozen times before, but always from men in tailored Italian suits or influencers wielding corporate gold cards. Never from a man in a plain navy hoodie sitting where the smell of floor cleaner drifted under the door. Across the opulent dining room, she felt the predatory gaze of the manager, Julian Vance. He stood with his arms folded, watching her like a hawk over a clipboard. She knew exactly what he was thinking, that Elias was a dine-and-dash risk, that he couldn't possibly afford a $1,000 dinner, and that if the bill went unpaid, the financial ruin would fall squarely on Maya's shoulders. "Is there a problem?" Elias asked gently. There was a subtle sharpness beneath his words, the sound of a man used to being obeyed. "No, sir," Maya replied quickly, turning on her heel toward the kitchen. At the terminal, the screen flashed a harsh red, demanding manager approval for such a high-value order. In a moment of pure, raw instinct, Maya didn't call Julian over. Instead, she hit the override and swiped her own employee ID, effectively staking her entire month's rent on a stranger in a hoodie. Behind her, Julian's voice boomed through the service hallway. "Did he pay up front?" "No, sir," she answered without looking back. "Then you better pray he does," Julian growled. But Maya wasn't praying, she was observing. She had a feeling that this man wasn't here to be served, he was here to see. And if that was true, he was about to see the darkest heart of the gilded hearth. Maya pushed through the double doors into the kitchen, a place of stainless steel and high-pressure chaos. What she saw next shattered the last sliver of silence she had been clinging to for months. Chef Miller, a man whose arrogance was even more famous than his sauces, was prepping the executive prime. As he leaned over the sizzling, expensive cut of Wagyu, a twisted, hateful grin spread across his face. Then, in an act that was quick, deliberate, and unmistakable, he leaned down and spat directly onto the meat. He didn't even flinch as he flipped the steak over, searing the insult into the fibers of the beef. The sous chef, standing beside him, didn't gasp in horror. He laughed. Maya froze, her boots feeling like they were leaded to the floor. Her first instinct was denial. Maybe she had misread the movement, maybe it was a mistake. But the laughter confirmed the truth. This wasn't an isolated incident of bad hygiene. This was a ritual. It was a systematic way of humbled those who didn't fit their narrow definition of who belonged in a place of privilege. Rage bubbled under Maya's skin, hot and sharp, but she couldn't scream. She knew that making a scene in the kitchen would only end with her being dragged out by security while the tainted steak was served anyway. She looked through the portal window into the dining room and saw Elias. He was still calm, still watching the room with those piercing, intelligent eyes. She began to suspect that this man was far more powerful than his hoodie suggested, and that realization changed the stakes of the game entirely. She had seconds to decide. She could serve the meal and protect her job, or she could take a risk that would likely end her career on the spot. With her hands trembling, she reached into her apron and pulled out her service pen. She snatched a fresh linen napkin from the warming rack. The ink skipped across the fine white threads as she wrote the words that would change everything. "They spit in your food. This place is not safe. Ask to see the kitchen cameras." She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. She folded the truth tight and slid it into her pocket just as Chef Miller handed her the silver-domed plate. Her heart pounded so loudly in her ears she feared the customers could hear it as she walked across the plush carpet. Elias looked up as she approached. With practiced, professional grace, she set the heavy plate before him and lifted the dome, allowing the rosemary smoke to billow out. "Enjoy your meal, sir," she said softly. Then, as she reached down with her right hand to clear his empty bread plate, her left hand moved with the precision of a card dealer. She slipped the folded napkin just under the corner of his place setting. A heartbeat later, she was gone. No eye contact, no further words, just a quiet, desperate hope that the man at table 14 knew how to read a whisper written in cloth. Elias Thorne sat perfectly still. He stared at the corner of the white linen as if it were a live wire. He hadn't touched the steak. He hadn't even lifted his knife. Something in the way Maya had breathed, the slight tremor in her fingers, had told him to wait. He reached forward slowly, sliding the napkin into his palm and unfolding it beneath the table. The words stared back at him, stark and desperate. "They spit in your food." Elias' jaw locked into a hard, granite line. It wasn't the spit itself that fueled the sudden, cold fire in his chest. He had seen the worst of humanity in his rise to the top. It was the phrase, "This place is not safe." That implied a rot that went deeper than one angry chef. It was systemic, and Maya wasn't just saving him from a bad meal, she was sounding a war horn. Elias folded the napkin, slipped it into the inside pocket of his hoodie, and pushed the $700 plate away untouched. The hunt had officially begun. The $700 steak sat untouched, a poisoned trophy of a dying empire. Julian thought he was dealing with a vagrant in a hoodie, but when Elias Thorne stands up, the room stops breathing. The manager is about to learn that the man he insulted doesn't just eat at the table, he owns the building. Elias Thorne didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't even look at the steak that had been seasoned with hate. He simply sat there, his eyes fixed on the kitchen doors, counting the seconds. In the high-stakes world of venture capital, Elias was known for his cold-blooded patience, the ability to sit in a room while it burned and wait for the exact moment to strike. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was a direct assault on his dignity, and more importantly, on the dignity of every person who walked through those doors looking like him. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a small, encrypted burner phone. He sent a single, 3-word text to a private security firm in New York. "Protocol Delta. Now." Across the room, Julian Vance was basking in his perceived victory. He was leaning against the mahogany host stand, whispering to the hostess and gesturing toward table 14 with a smirk. To Julian, this was a win. He had put a peasant in his place, forced Maya to take the risk, and soon he would have a reason to trespass the man in the hoodie and fire the waitress who dared to serve him. He was a man who thrived on the tiny, pathetic high of exerting power over those he deemed lesser. But then Elias Thorne stood up. He didn't stand up like a tired diner. He stood up like a king reclaiming a throne. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The air seemed to thin. Elias didn't head for the exit. He headed straight for Julian's elevated podium. "The manager's office," Elias said. It wasn't a request. It was a command that carried the resonance of a gavel hitting a block. Julian straightened his tie, his smirk morphing into a mask of professional irritation. "Sir, if there's a problem with your bill, we can discuss it at the—" "I said," Elias interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a quiet, lethal intensity. "The office. Now, Or we can have this conversation right here, in front of the local news crew that is currently 3 minutes away from your front door." Julian's face went pale. The mention of the media was a bluff, but Elias delivered it with such absolute certainty that the manager's bravado crumbled. Julian gestured toward the back hallway, leading Elias past the wine cellar and into a plush, windowless office that smelled of expensive cigars and old money. Once the door clicked shut, Julian turned, trying to regain his footing. "Look, I don't know who you think you are coming in here in that attire and demanding." "Who I think I am," Elias cut him off. He reached up and slowly pulled back the hood of his sweatshirt. He stepped into the light of the desk lamp, letting the manager see his face clearly. "My name is Elias Thorne. I am the chairman and CEO of Thorne Capital Holdings. I am the man who bought the debt of the parent company that owns this mansion. I am the man who paid for those drapes, that desk, and the very air you are currently wasting." The silence that followed was deafening. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a man watching his own execution. He knew the name. Everyone in the hospitality industry knew the name. Elias Thorne was the shadow owner, the silent titan who had been buying up historic properties across the South to revitalize them. Mr. Thorne, I had no idea," Julian stammered, his voice jumping a few pitches. "We have protocols, security concerns. If I had known it was you." "That's the problem, Julian," Elias said, leaning over the desk until he was inches from the manager's face. "You only treat people with dignity when you think they have the power to ruin you, but you missed something. Everyone has the power to ruin you if you're stupid enough to give them a reason." Elias pulled the folded napkin from his pocket and smoothed it out on the desk. "They spit in your food." Julian stared at the napkin as if it were a coiled cobra. That's a lie, a disgruntled employee. Maya, she's always been a troublemaker. She's trying to extort." "Shut up," Elias whispered. The word was sharper than a knife. "I watched the kitchen through the portal. I saw the laughter. I saw the behavior of your hostess. And right now, my tech team is remotely bypassing your secure server to download the last 48 hours of kitchen footage. If I find one frame that confirms what is written on this cloth, you won't just be unemployed. You'll be unhireable. Forever." Julian's hand shook as he reached for the phone. "I'll call the chef. We can clear this up." "You'll call no one," Elias commanded. "You will sit in that chair. You will not touch your phone. You will not leave this room. We are going to sit here in silence and wait for the download to finish. And while we wait, I want you to think about the girl who wrote this. I want you to think about Maya Vance, because while you were busy trying to be a gatekeeper, she was busy being a human being." Elias sat down in the guest chair, crossing his legs and looking at his watch. Outside the office, the muffled sounds of the dinner rush continued. The clinking of crystal, the soft jazz, the laughter of the elite. They had no idea that the foundation of the building was currently being pulverized. In the kitchen, Maya Vance was leaning against a prep table, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had seen Elias walk into the office with Julian. She knew what was coming. Either a miracle was about to happen, or she had just signed her own eviction notice. She looked at Chef Miller, who was already prepping another steak, humming a tune, completely unaware that the man he had insulted was currently holding his entire life in the palm of his hand. Back in the office, a soft ping came from Elias' burner phone. He looked down. The file transfer was complete. He swiped through the footage, his face turning into a mask of cold, concentrated fury. He didn't need to watch much. At 8:22 p.m., the camera clearly showed Chef Miller leaning over the executive prime. The act was clear. The malice was undeniable. Elias looked up at Julian, who was sweating through his silk shirt. "Julian," Elias said softly, "have you ever seen a kingdom fall in real time? Because you're about to." The kitchen was a sanctuary of secrets, but they forgot one thing. The walls have ears and the shadows have eyes. Maya Vance was supposed to be a ghost, a silent server of their arrogance. But tonight, the ghost is speaking, and every word she utters is a nail in the coffin of their careers. The air in the manager's office was thick, stagnant with the smell of old paper and the metallic tang of Julian's rising panic. Elias Thorne sat behind the desk, a desk he technically owned, scrolling through the high-definition playback on his phone. The footage was grainy but undeniable. He watched the loop over and over, the tilt of Chef Miller's head, the casual cruelty of the act, and the celebratory laughter of the kitchen staff. It was a snuff film for a reputation. "Bring her in," Elias said, not looking up. Julian fumbled with the intercom, his fingers slick with sweat. "Maya Vance, please report to the manager's office, immediately." Out in the dining room, the sound of Maya's name over the speaker felt like a death knell. The other servers whispered behind their hands. They had seen her slip the note. They had seen the billionaire, still known to them only as the hoodie guy, disappear into the back. They assumed she was being fired. They assumed the problem was being erased. Maya walked down the narrow service hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She passed the kitchen window, where Chef Miller was plating another masterpiece, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He didn't even look at her. Why would he? In his world, she was less than the garnish on his plates. She pushed open the heavy oak door to the office and stopped. The scene was not what she expected. Julian wasn't sitting in his high-backed leather chair. He was standing in the corner, looking small, his face the color of spoiled milk. The man from table 14 was sitting in the seat of power. He had pulled his hood down, revealing a face of striking authority and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 100 storms. "Close the door, Maya," Elias said. His voice was no longer the quiet whisper of a guest. It was the resonant baritone of a commander. Maya obeyed, her hands still shaking. "Sir, I can explain the note. I couldn't let you eat that. I didn't care about the job anymore, "I know why you did it," Elias interrupted, finally looking up. He stood, and the sheer presence of him seemed to shrink the room. "And I want you to know that in 20 years of business, I have seen men with Ivy League degrees and million-dollar salaries show less integrity than you did tonight with a pen and a napkin." He turned the phone screen toward her. The footage was paused on the exact moment the violation occurred. Maya felt a wave of nausea hit her. Seeing it again, framed in the digital glow, made the reality even more sickening. "This is Chef Miller," Elias stated. "He thinks he's an artist. He thinks this kitchen is his kingdom." He then turned his gaze to Julian. "And Julian here thinks he's the gatekeeper of tradition. He thinks that by seating people like me by the restrooms and ignoring us, he's preserving the sanctity of the hearth." "Mr. Thorne, please," Julian begged, finding his voice. "Miller is the reason we have the stars. He's the reason the critics love us if we lose him over one lapse in judgment." "A lapse in judgment?" Elias stepped closer to Julian, his shadow looming over the man. "Spitting in a man's food because of the color of his skin or the clothes on his back isn't a lapse, Julian. It's a signature. It tells me everything I need to know about the culture you've built here. You didn't just allow this, you nurtured it." Elias turned back to Maya. "How long, Maya? How long has this been the standard at the Gilded Hearth?" Maya took a breath, the fear finally giving way to a cold, hard clarity. If she was going down, she was taking the whole rotten structure with her. "Since the day I started, sir. It's not just the food, it's the way the reservations are screened. If a name sounds too black, we're told the house is full. It's the way the tips are pooled. I'm forced to give a larger cut to the back of the house, even when they call me names I won't repeat in this office. It's a system, Mr. Thorne. It's a machine designed to make people like us feel like we're lucky just to be allowed through the door." The silence that followed was absolute. Elias nodded slowly. He wasn't surprised, but the confirmation was a bitter pill. He reached out and picked up the linen napkin, the evidence of Maya's bravery. "Julian," Elias said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "I want you to go out there. I want you to tell Chef Miller to stop whatever he is doing. Tell him to turn off the stoves. Tell the staff to stop serving. And tell the guests that the restaurant is closed, effectively immediately." "Closed," Julian gasped. "Sir, the dining room is full. There are senators out there. There are." "I don't care if the president is out there eating dessert," Elias roared, his voice finally breaking into a thunderous intensity. "This house is built on filth, and I will not own a single brick of a building that operates on hate. Go, now, or the next person you talk to will be the police officer waiting to charge you with accessory to battery." Julian scrambled out of the office, nearly tripping over his own feet. Elias stood there for a moment, his chest heaving slightly. He then looked at Maya. She was standing tall now, her shoulders back, the weight of the secret finally lifted. "You're a law student, aren't you?" Elias asked, his tone softening. Maya blinked, surprised. I had to stop when my mother got sick. I still have the books, though." Elias walked over to the window, looking out at the Charleston skyline. "The law is about more than books, Maya. It's about the courage to stand for the truth when the truth is expensive. Tonight, you were the only lawyer in this building." He turned back to her, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. "Don't worry about your paycheck. From this moment on, you aren't working for Julian. You're working for me, and we have a lot of cleaning up to do." Outside, the sounds of the restaurant began to change. The jazz stopped. The low hum of conversation turned into confused murmurs, then sharp outcries of, "What do you mean, closed?" The reckoning had begun. The music stopped, the wine stopped pouring, and the golden boy of the culinary world was about to find out that his secret ingredient was his own downfall. When a billionaire decides to burn it down, he doesn't need a match, he just needs the footage. The kitchen is about to get a lot hotter than the stoves. The transition from fine dining to fateful reckoning happened in less than 60 seconds. Julian Vance stumbled out of the office, his legs moving like he was walking on a deck in a hurricane. He reached the center of the dining room, a room filled with the scent of expensive perfume and aged steak, and signaled the house pianist to stop. The sudden silence was jarring, a physical weight that made heads turn and forks drop. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's voice cracked, sounding thin and fragile against the high ceilings. We have an emergency maintenance issue. We must ask you to settle your tabs and vacate the premises immediately. Your meals tonight are on the house." A roar of confused protests erupted. Senators, socialites, and local power players looked up in disbelief. But Elias Thorne didn't wait for the room to clear. He stepped out of the office, his hoodie down, his gaze fixed on the kitchen's swinging doors. He didn't look like a customer anymore. He looked like an avenging shadow. He walked past the confused elite, ignoring the questions, and pushed through the double doors into the kitchen. The heat hit him first, a wall of steam, grease, and the frantic energy of a high-pressure service. Chef Miller was at the pass, screaming at a line cook about the garnish on a plate of scallops. He didn't see Elias enter. He didn't see the silent fury radiating off the man he had just tried to poison. "Who the hell let you in here?" Miller barked, not even looking up from his plate. "Get this vagrant out of my kitchen." "Your kitchen." Elias' voice cut through the clatter of pans like a gunshot. Miller froze. He finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the man from table 14. A sneer curled his lip. I told Julian to have you removed 10 minutes ago. You've got 5 seconds before I throw a pot of boiling water at your—" "I wouldn't finish that sentence, Miller," Elias said, stepping into the center of the line. The chefs and prep cooks stopped. The dishwasher went still. Even the vents seemed to hum lower. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up for everyone to see. He hit play on the footage. There, on the screen, in high-definition clarity, was Miller leaning over the executive prime. There was the spit. There was the laughter. The silence that followed was visceral. Miller's face went from a flush of anger to a ghostly, sickly white. The sous chef, who had laughed in the footage, took a step back, his eyes darting toward the exit. "In the world I come from," Elias said, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying calm, "we call this a breach of contract. In the world you're about to enter, they call it aggravated battery. You didn't just disrespect a guest. You committed a crime in a building that bears my name." You can't prove that's me," Miller stammered, his bravado dissolving into pathetic desperation. "The lighting, the angle, it's a setup." "I don't need to prove it to a jury yet," Elias replied. "I only needed to prove it to myself. I am Elias Thorne. I own the land this building sits on. I own the equipment you're standing next to. And as of 30 seconds ago, I've pulled the operating license for this entire establishment." Elias turned to the rest of the staff, the line cooks, the dishwashers, the people who had watched Miller's tyranny for years in silence. "Anyone who knew about this and said nothing, you're done. But anyone who has been forced to endure this man's rot, you have a choice. You can leave now and find work elsewhere, or you can stay, tell the truth to my legal team, and help me build something that isn't a monument to hate." He looked back at Miller. "As for you, get out, don't grab your knives, don't grab your coat. If you're still on this property in 2 minutes, my security team, who are currently waiting at the service entrance, will ensure your exit is much less refined than your cooking." Miller looked around, searching for an ally. He looked at the sous chef who looked at the floor. He looked at Julian, who was trembling in the doorway. He realized in one crashing moment that his kingdom had vanished. He was no longer a chef, he was a liability. As Miller was escorted out the back by 2 towering men in suits who had appeared as if from the shadows, Elias turned his attention to the dining room. The guests were filing out, their voices hushed as they saw the police cars pulling into the valet circle. But Elias wasn't looking at the celebrities. He was looking at Maya. She was standing by the server station, her apron off, her hands folded. She looked like she had just survived a war. "Maya," Elias called out. She walked over, her eyes meeting his. "Is it over, sir?" "The destruction is over," Elias said, looking around at the empty, silent kitchen. "But the reconstruction, that's just beginning. I told you I'm shutting this place down, and I am. But in 3 months, this doors will open again. It won't be the gilded hearth. It'll be something new, something honest." He paused, a rare moment of genuine emotion flickering in his eyes. "And I'm going to need a general manager who knows exactly what it feels like to be on the other side of that door." Maya stared at him, the weight of the offer sinking in. You want me to run this place?" "I want you to lead it," Elias corrected. "Finish your law degree on my dime. But while you're doing it, show this city that you don't need a legacy of exclusion to have a standard of excellence." The storm hadn't just broken the building, it had cleared the air. The invisible king had revealed himself, but it was the waitress who had held the crown all along. The elite thought they were untouchable behind their velvet ropes and gold-rimmed glasses. But when the sun rose over Charleston, the gilded empire wasn't just closed, it was a crime scene. Secrets are like shadows. They vanish when you bring the light. And Elias Thorne, he just turned on the sun. The morning after the shutdown, the city of Charleston woke up to a different world. By 6:00 a.m., the local news vans were lined up like a funeral procession outside the heavy oak doors of the mansion. The headline on every digital screen from the Battery to North Charleston read, "Chef arrested. Billionaire owner shuts down the Gilded Hearth amidst allegations of hate crimes." Elias Thorne didn't hide. He didn't release a sanitized corporate statement through a third-party PR firm. He sat in the back of a black SUV, watching the feed from his legal team's headquarters. He was a man who understood that to kill a weed, you don't just snip the leaves, you poison the root. The legal fallout was a surgical strike. By noon, Chef Miller was being arraigned on charges of felony food tampering and aggravated battery. The footage Elias had captured was being played on a loop on national television. It wasn't just about the spit anymore. It was about the culture of the kitchen. Other former employees, emboldened by Maya's bravery, began to step forward. Dishwashers spoke of being denied breaks. Servers spoke of the code words Julian used to identify black patrons they wanted to discourage. Julian Vance, the man who thought he was a kingmaker, found himself in a windowless room at the precinct, sweating through another expensive silk shirt. He wasn't being charged with the spit, but he was being investigated for labor law violations and civil rights infringements. The tradition he had worked so hard to protect had become a noose around his neck. But the real reckoning happened in the quiet spaces. Elias met Maya in a small, sunlight-drenched office in the legal district. She looked different. The exhaustion was still there, but the fear had been replaced by a fierce, quiet dignity. She wasn't carrying a tray, she was carrying a stack of files. "The settlement for the employees is ready," Elias said, sliding a document across the table. "Every person who was mistreated, every person who was bypassed for promotion because of Julian's policies, they're getting a piece of the recovery. But that's the easy part." He looked her directly in the eye. "The hard part is what we do next. I told you I wanted you to lead. I've already started the process of rebranding. The hearth is dead. We're calling it the Anchor." "The Anchor?" Maya asked, a small smile finally touching her lips. "Because it's going to hold this community down," Elias said. "It's going to be the standard. We're hearing from the neighborhood. We're sourcing from black-owned farms. We're turning that mansion from a fortress of exclusion into a house of hospitality." But the reckoning wasn't just for the staff. It was for the city. Elias used his influence to pull his investments from 3 other high-end developments until they agreed to an independent audit of their hearing and service practices. He was moving through the industry like a scythe. He didn't just want one restaurant to change. He wanted to break the system that allowed gilded hearths to exist in the first place. That afternoon, a video went viral. It wasn't the kitchen footage. It was a clip of Elias Thorne walking out of the police station. A reporter shoved a microphone in his face and asked, "Mr. Thorne, aren't you worried about the millions of dollars you're losing by shutting down such a profitable business?" Elias stopped. He looked into the camera, his gaze cold enough to freeze blood. "I've made a lot of money in my life," he said, "but I've never made a cent that was worth more than a person's dignity. If a business can only be profitable by dehumanizing its workers and its guests, then that business deserves to die. I'm not losing money, I'm clearing a debt." The video was shared 10 million times in 4 hours. The invisible king had spoken, and the message was clear. The old guard was over. Back at the restaurant, the gold-rimmed glassware was being packed into crates. The velvet drapes, the color of dried blood, were being torn down. Maya stood in the center of the empty dining room, listening to the silence. It didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like a clean slate. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the linen napkin. It was wrinkled and stained with ink, a small, fragile thing that had toppled an empire. She looked at the words one last time. "They spit in your food." She didn't throw it away. She folded it neatly and placed it in her bag. She would frame it one day. Not as a reminder of the hate, but as a reminder of the moment she decided her voice was worth more than her paycheck. The storm had passed, but the air was still electric. The reconstruction was beginning, and for the first time in her life, Maya Vance wasn't just waiting for the future, she was building it. An empire didn't just crumble, it evolved. They tried to bury the truth in a kitchen, but they only succeeded in planting a seed. Today, the doors open again, and for the first time, everyone is invited to the table. This is the end of a tragedy and the birth of a legend. 3 months later, the heavy oak doors of the Charleston mansion swung open once more. But the air around the building had changed. The oppressive, heavy scent of old money and exclusion had evaporated, replaced by the fragrant, welcoming aroma of low-country spices and fresh-baked cornbread. The gold-rimmed glassware was gone. The velvet drapes the color of dried blood had been replaced by wide, open windows that let the South Carolina sun pour onto the reclaimed wood tables. Above the entrance, a simple, elegant sign hung in the breeze, the anchor. Inside, the transformation was total. The staff wasn't a collection of fearful, invisible ghosts anymore. They were a team. They were paid a living wage, they were respected, and they were led by a woman who knew exactly what it meant to fight for her dignity. Maya Vance stood in the center of the dining room, no longer wearing a stained apron, but a sharp, tailored blazer. She was the general manager, the heartbeat of the operation, and a symbol of what happens when courage meets opportunity. Chef Miller and Julian Vance were gone, relics of a dark past. Miller had been banned from the industry, his name a permanent cautionary tale in culinary schools across the country. Julian had disappeared into the shadows of litigation, his gatekeeper reputation shattered beyond repair. They hadn't just lost their jobs, they had lost their power. But the real story was at table 14. Elias Thorne sat in the same spot where he had once received that fateful napkin. Today, he wasn't wearing a hoodie. He was dressed in a simple charcoal suit, watching the room with a quiet, satisfied smile. He watched as a diverse crowd, families from the neighborhood, young professionals and tourists alike, shared meals without looking over their shoulders. Maya walked over to his table, holding a small, framed object. She set it down in front of him. Inside the glass was the original linen napkin, the ink slightly faded but the words still screaming with truth. They spit in your food. A reminder, Elias asked, looking up at her. A foundation, Maya replied. I keep it in the office to remind me that a restaurant is just a building. It's the people inside who give it a soul. Elias nodded. The fire didn't destroy everything, Maya. It just revealed what was already rotting so we could build something that lasts. You didn't just save me from a bad meal that night. You saved this city from its own reflection. As the dinner rush began, the atmosphere wasn't one of hushed whispers and judgment. It was one of joy. The anchor wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary. It was proof that excellence doesn't require exclusion, and that a Black story isn't just about the struggle, it's about the victory that follows the fire. Elias watched Maya move through the room, greeting guests by name, her head held high. She was finishing her law degree at night, but during the day, she was practicing a different kind of justice. She was ensuring that no one who walked through those doors would ever feel invisible again. The lesson of the Gilded Hearth isn't just about a billionaire and a waitress. It's about the everyday people in quiet jobs doing extraordinary things. It's about the fact that you don't need a title to have clarity. You don't need a boardroom to have power. You just need the courage to write the truth and the heart to pass it to someone who will listen. Naomi, the name Maya used to be called in the whispers of the old kitchen, didn't have power then, but she had a choice. She saw something wrong, and instead of looking away to protect her paycheck, she acted. She didn't scream, she didn't protest. She wrote a note, And that small, quiet act of defiance shifted the world. And it's the responsibility of those in power, like Elias Thorne, to recognize that bravery and do something with it. Because of him, an empire didn't just fall, it evolved. So, as the sun sets over Charleston and the lights of the anchor begin to glow, I have one question for you. What injustice have you seen and stayed quiet about? What whispered truth are you holding onto because you're afraid of the cost? And more importantly, what might change if you finally had the courage to speak up? Call to action. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that integrity is the only currency that truly matters, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to know that one act of courage can change the course of history. And if you want more stories like this, the raw, the real, and the righteous stories they don't put in textbooks, subscribe. Because sometimes it's not the big speeches or the bold protests that shift the world. Sometimes it's just a napkin and someone brave enough to write the truth on it. Thank you for watching. Keep your eyes open, and never ever be afraid to tell the truth.